You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, and we're talking about should Christians embrace Darwin and getting into some of the biblical as well as scientific issues associated with that. Let's start taking some phone calls. We'll start in Maine, WBCI, or L, I guess it is. And Christian, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Kerby, Dr. Meyer, good to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. What would you like to say?
A couple things. One is, as just a layperson, of course, I find evolution extremely interesting and the argument against it as being a Christian. But one of the things for the layperson, the lay Christian, the television shows that have the wonderful depictions of God creation, and then the thing that they do is they'll tag this little sentence at the end saying, and in essence making evolution God. They'll say, through millions of years, evolution has taken the, puffin or whatever it is to the point where, and so whether they use the word evolution or nature, they just quickly attach that in, and that it's done many, many times a day. And like I say, the footage that these shows have are fantastic. But, to my children, I'll always say, do you see how they did that? Do you see how they pointed that out?
Sure.
So I wanted to make that comment. Then the other comment I wanted to make is just about the fossil record. And one of the things, I was having an argument with, a nice argument with an evolutionist one day, and I just happened to look down on the ground, and there were a bunch of maple leaves, and I grabbed the maple leaves as we were talking, and I threw them up in the air, and they all pinwheeled, the breeze took them and they pinwheeled many, many, many feet away. And I said, show me in the fossil record where that maple leaf became what it is today. Show me that. And then the other thing is the total lack in the fossil record of any kind of change to invertebrates. So what makes the best fossil? We know that basically hard things make the best fossils. So things such as insects make fantastic fossils, and we see just tons of it, all crustaceans, and we see just tons of it. I mean, there's probably now collected, I bet, millions and millions of fossils. Yet when we look at those things, they're just like they are today as they were then. And that's just one of the most wonderful things that we see, that God continually lays down. This is what it is. Now, as far as natural selection, I think some of that is terminology in this sense. If we see a species have a hard time and die, and I think you alluded to some of it, have a hard time and he dies and it dies out, we could say that through natural selection or environmental changes, that thing became either died out or became slightly different the way it is. But there's no macro change to that thing. So there's nothing, not one thing becomes another, but there may be slight changes, but a bird remains a bird, remains a bird, just as God says in Genesis, things are of its kind. So he says that right in the beginning, that it's of its kind, and that's all I really wanted to say.
You said quite a bit. Let me pick off one of those because, Stephen, if nothing else, your book on Darwin's Doubt kind of gets us into the fossil record. And you mentioned two issues, the abrupt appearance and then what I call stasis. That is, if you see the first horseshoe crab, it looks like the one you'd see on the beach. If you look at some of the insects he's mentioned, the amber, the Baltic amber, it looks just the same. You look at the first bat in the fossil record, the first dolphin in the fossil record, whatever. They all pretty much look like the ones that are swimming around or flying around or walking around today.
Well, this is one of the really puzzling things about the fossil record from a Darwinian point of view. What you expect from a Darwinian point of view is a slow, gradual unfolding of simple to complex, where the simplest forms are gradually morphing into more and more complex forms of life on different lines of descent. Instead, what you find is, in particular, in the animal, the record of the first animals, which is what my book Darwin's Doubt is about, an event in the history of life called the Cambrian explosion, in which you have the geologically abrupt appearance of most of the major animal groups that have ever existed on Earth. They're called the phyla, and these new animal forms, exemplifying completely different, what are called body plans, come into the fossil record very abruptly. And then, in many cases, the forms either go extinct after some time, or they continue right to the present day. One of the forms that arose in the Cambrian was a comb jelly, and the fossils of comb jellies have exhibited stasis since the Cambrian right to the present. They're almost identical to the ones you find out in Puget Sound, where I live. So I think your caller is onto something important. And in the book Darwin's Doubt, I tell the story of Darwin's own doubt about the fossil record. That he was concerned that the pattern, especially the pattern of the first appearance of the Cambrian animals, did not match the Tree of Life picture of the history of life, which he was articulating and defending in The Origin of Species. And I tell the story of the doubt that he expressed and what's become of it, and how it's grown up to become, I think, a major crisis in evolutionary theory, because the problem isn't just the problem of the missing fossils, it's also the deeper, in a sense, engineering problem of how would the evolutionary process ever build these complex forms of life, arising as they do so suddenly in the geological record.
Lots of great questions and comments. Like to do the best I can to give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. So let's go to Missouri, KCMH. Karen, you're on with Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Hi, I enjoy your show, and I would love to hear Dr. Meyer's perspective on seeing as the viewpoint is from simple to complex, and what we're doing with genetically modification of our food, and the gene where we're manipulating the genes but not taking into the account the epigenes, and where we're finding some effects on future generations of manipulated foods. What is your ideas on what we're doing with our foods?
I don't have a really a firm opinion on that. My wife's a dietitian, and she knows more about it than I do. But one thing, you mentioned the epigenes, or the epigenetic information that's required, and that is something I address in Darwin's Doubt quite extensively, because it actually poses another really formidable problem to the creative power of mutation and natural selection. The Darwinian idea is that new forms of life arise as the information in DNA is altered by random mutations. But scientists are learning that in addition to the information in DNA, there is information at higher levels stored in different ways besides just stored in DNA in cells and in animals. And this is called epigenetic information, or ontogenetic information, information that is stored beyond the genes. Now, if all of the information needed to build an animal is not stored in DNA, then you could mutate DNA indefinitely without respect to time or number of trials, and you would never generate a whole new form of animal life. And so the discovery that there is actually a kind of hierarchical layering of different kinds of information stored in living organisms is perhaps the most fundamental challenge of all to the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism. I understand that's not the question you asked about, but I'm very interested in what you said about the epigenetic component in building animal form. It's a really big problem for Darwinian theory, or modern Darwinian theory, and it's one of the things that's leading many evolutionary biologists to say things like neo-Darwinism has no theory of the generative. It can explain the small changes, but it can't explain the origin of fundamentally new forms of life.
And back to what Karen was asking, we will do a program in the future on genetic engineering, because one of the things we recognize is that now with recombinant DNA research and gene splicing and all sorts of things, we, as one wag said, it can rewrite the 5th and 6th days of creation. And I would think that, Stephen, if nothing else, we recognize how little we know about the cell. So we have the technological ability almost to be God, but do we have the wisdom to act like it? And now that we have recognized that the original theory that you had one gene, one protein, and that these were just like a series of connectors and they were all easily determined by the DNA. Now we recognize that sometimes the DNA code reads to forward, it reads back, it doubles back over it. There isn't junk DNA like we were told before.
Exactly.
There's epigenetic stuff. So the same problem that is causing problems for the evolutionists should cause geneticists to say, maybe we don't know enough here to start fiddling with this as much as we are. And so I'll do that maybe in a future program, because I think she's raised a good question, but it's a little off of target of what we've been talking about today. Well, but I can see why it makes the case for you in terms of evolution and arguing against it.
It's a great topic, and and what you're saying about the new genomics, what we're learning about the genome, is also highly relevant to some of the things we've been discussing with theistic evolution, because one of the biggest, the most common arguments for humans and chimps sharing a common ancestry is the alleged 98% similarity of the human and chimp genome. But that was 98% similar when we were just comparing the 2% of the genome that we knew coded for proteins, and when the biologists were assuming that all the rest of the genome was junk. Now that we know that the rest of the genome is not junk, that it's functioning something like an operating system that's controlling the timing and the expression of those data files, the files for building the proteins, we've learned something really important. And that is that the non-coding regions that we used to think were junk, that we now know are functional, are species-specific. They're very different between chimps and humans, suggesting not common ancestry, but possible separate ancestry. And that's really changing the debate about theistic evolution.
Be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Dr. Stephen Meyer. Let me again mention his book, Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt. We have great information about that on our website. We have a link to his website and also a very good article that you might want to read, Should Christians Embrace Darwin? And we do make that available to you on our website, pointofview.net. Let's go to North Carolina this time, WLGP. Andrea, you're on with Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Hey, thanks. Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Again, I'm going to say, you're going to laugh at me, True You Project. We're not going there today, okay? But look, question. You know, there's so many endangered species now, and so I'm going to ask you, which is not really related, climate change, global warming, so many things, so many animals, panthers in Florida, dolphins be getting caught in a curve up there in New Jersey. There's so many weird things happening, and that has to do with climate change and global warming. And I've listened to 4 of your episodes on the True You Project, and I didn't listen to all of it yet. But you were talking about the relationship, and this is all science, so help me out with this. There's a relationship, and it is in order, so help me with that. This really doesn't have anything to do, Kerby, I'm sorry. It does, but it doesn't.
Sure, I think a very close relationship to the issue of intelligent design is on the environment. And whenever I teach, for example, I teach a course on creation, I always have a section on environment because I think probably the best book on it ever written was by Francis Schaeffer, Pollution and the Death of Man, because some people, Stephen, try to resolve the environmental issue by making us just like the animals. That's kind of the naturalistic point of view. The other way is they become pantheists, like the New Agers, and they make everybody imbued with God. And what we need to understand is there's a distinction between humans and animals. We share something with God because we're created in God's image. We also share something with the creation because we are created. And once you start thinking about that, you recognize we should be good environmental stewards. But I think we also need to be skeptical about some of the things being said right now about climate change. How would you react to this?
I think you said that very well. I remember my son in his college biology class. He had to take a class on ecology in his biology major, and the professor the first day said, "Well, we have a moral obligation to care for creation." And then the next day, teaching evolution, said, "Well, we're indistinguishable from the other animals. We're just the more complex animals." And my son said, "Well, wait a minute. Something about those two statements don't comport." So I think there is. You struck the balance beautifully in the way you described that. I am, however, I do share your skepticism about some of the claims that are being made about human-caused global warming. And I think there's an interesting dynamic that's similar to the dynamic in the evolution debate, where there is legitimate scientific skepticism being raised about an alleged consensus, and rather than the defenders of the consensus dealing with the scientific arguments, there's been a tendency to stigmatize, marginalize, try to suppress dissent, say that the debate is over when it's not really over. And a couple of years ago, we had a private meeting with some leading scientists who are skeptical about human-caused global warming, including Dick Lindzen, who is holds an endowed chair at MIT, no slouch, and a climatologist himself. And the atmosphere in the meeting was just electric as scientists in both of these two debates met each other, many of whom didn't know much about the other scientists' issues, but found that the sociology of suppressed dissent was really powerful in both of these scientific debates and communities. Amazing. And so we can't assume that scientists are just objective guys, the guys in white coats that are just looking at the data. There are ideological sympathies and factors in play, and so I think there's a real need for critical thinking.
I would encourage our listeners to type in the words in a Google search, Richard Sternberg, and you can see what happened to him when he published an article by Stephen Meyer. But let's take another call real quickly because I want to try to give as many a chance to join the conversation. This time we'll head out to California. KYCC, McKinley, you're on.
Well, see, thank you very much. I have a question for the doctor, but I'm not going to in any way refute his brilliant deductions, but I do want to underscore the fact of the creative latitude that's been built into the original design, because even as Jesus himself said in one of his parables, that the earth brings forth of itself first the blade and then the full head and the grain, while at the same time continuing to acknowledge and underscore the fact of divine origins. But my question for the doctor, and I've been attempting to reach him for many months unsuccessfully through his website, but I can't seem to get through. But my question is, does Darwin anywhere discount or seek to refute the fact of the existence of a deity?
He gives some lip service to it in the end of The Origin of Species, but he privately acknowledged by the end of his life that his science had made him deeply skeptical about the existence of God. He was officially an agnostic, and he claimed to be. He confessed that he was in a complete muddle about metaphysics, meaning he really he didn't know, but he was really defending and articulating a materialistic understanding of origins. And so the logic of his position, I think, was leading away from belief in God. I love your first comment, though, as well, because there's a leading evolutionary biologist who's developing one of these new theories of evolution named James Shapiro at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
And he's been mapping out what he calls, but essentially the pre-programmed adaptive capacity that's built into organisms. And he shows that such mutations as occur are not occurring randomly. They're occurring under something like algorithmic control, where there's a change in the environment and the organism is turning on or turning off certain genes in response to those changes in order to enhance its ability to survive. And we think that's actually he's not an advocate of intelligent design. He talks about natural genetic engineering, but all of these processes of natural genetic engineering presuppose this pre-programmed adaptive capacity. And that's I think the pre-programmed adaptive capacity is actually a locus of design. It's evidence of design, because Shapiro doesn't explain where the pre-programming comes from. I think you need intelligent design to do that. I discuss his work in one of the later chapters of my book, Darwin's Doubt. I think he's a fascinating scientist, and some of what he's discovered, I think, really supports the first point that you just made.
Well, again, I might just mention 600 pages in Signature in the Cell, about 500 pages in Darwin's Doubt. It'll keep you busy over the summer, and this is one of the things we encourage you to do. Read. You will find that even though these are scientific books, this individual, Stephen Meyer, is a very gifted communicator, as you probably have already can determine, and certainly could benefit a great deal from his books. And I might also mention some of the great videos that have been produced by Illustra Media, in which he and other of his companions are in those, and all the other great resources at the Discovery Institute. So, Stephen Meyer, thank you for a very good discussion today about whether Christians should embrace Darwin, and thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
It's been great to be with you, Kerby, and I just mentioned also that the debate I had with Carl Giberson is available. You can watch the whole thing on my website at darwinsdoubt.com. There's a nice YouTube channel there with the debates and animations and interviews and things.
Very good. And again, like I said, we have a link to Stephen Meyer's website, which links you to those others. And, of course, you can figure out how to find all of those by coming to our website. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us. Let's do it again sometime.
Hey, you bet. Great conversation.
We will take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with George Marsden. He has a new book out, so we're going to move from origins to history. I think you're going to appreciate that conversation as well, and we'll open up the phones, although I suspect it'll be a little more of a teaching time. But if there are some comments that you want to make, we give you as much of an opportunity as possible. Obviously, each one of you only had a short time on the air because we only have a short time in even the hour interview that we've done. But if you wanted to know a little bit more about this ongoing debate about whether Christians should embrace Darwin and Darwinism, we certainly give you that opportunity to read some things that have been posted on our website. You can watch the video by going to his website, and we have that link under web links. So great resources available to you at the Point of View website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that if you haven't already taken the time to sign up, we have a Get Involved button, and it's a way in which you just give us your email, and then there's a number of check boxes. And if you'd like to receive my daily commentary, we'd love to send that to you. We send out show threads, which actually indicates what is going to be on the program that day with all the web links, all of the various information. It also has a political cartoon, which a lot of people enjoy getting, and they take some of that and post it on their Facebook page or their blog. And so all of it is available at the website pointofview.net. And most importantly, if you think that this was a good discussion that maybe others need to hear, you might want to go to our podcast button, click on that, and you can watch it again or send it to someone else, because it's a conversation that we think needs to take place. Let's take a break. We'll come back and work our way through the history of America right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
how I adore you. I can't stop thinking about you. Jesus, I love you, how I adore you. I can't stop thinking about you.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour on Point of View, we're going to go back to the 1950s as we discuss the book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. You might say, well, why talk about the 1950s? Well, the transition from the 1950s to the 1960s was really one of the most significant changes in American culture. And frankly, I would argue that you really cannot understand such things as the rise of feminism, of the civil rights movement, even the culture wars, without looking at some of the embryonic seeds of those ideas and movements back in the 1950s. We just the other day celebrated the 60th anniversary of the court case Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Earlier this year, we, of course, talked about the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. And as you will see, many of the topics that we talk about here on Point of View on a regular basis have their origin in the 1950s. And as I think you'll also see, the 1950s, as the subtitle says, were a crisis for liberal belief. The author of this book is George Marsden, and if you love history as many of us do, you certainly are familiar with many of his books. Emeritus professor of history from Notre Dame, taught there from 1992 to 2008. Before that, he taught at Calvin College and taught about history and the history of Christianity, also at the Divinity School of Duke University, and has been a visiting professor at lots of places, University of California, Berkeley, St. Andrews University, Harvard Divinity School, and others. You may be familiar with some of his books, The Soul of the American University, Fundamentalism and the American Culture, The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship, and one on Jonathan Edwards. He is the author of this book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. Dr. Marsden, a delight to have you on the program with us today.
I am very pleased to be with you.
One of the things that we have done here is also posted one of a number of book reviews that were on your book. We also have a link to your website so people can find out a little bit more about the book website. But again, we wanted people to know a little bit more about this because you've always felt the need to go back and look at the 1950s. And in my introduction, I talked about the fact that a lot of these ideas that sort of sprung forth in the 60s, Betty Friedan and feminism, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and others, you really, to understand some of that, have to go back to the 1950s, don't you?
Exactly. The reason things fell apart in the 1960s had a lot to do with the inadequacy of the cultural ideals of the 1950s. That 1950s things looked like they should work, but they didn't really, and so people were trying to build a consensus, trying to find a central set sort of ideals that everybody could be assimilated to, and then that pretty much blew apart in the 1960s.
One of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I recognize I have an audience that is much younger than you or I, and what they might know about the 1950s comes from the TV show Mad Men, or maybe if they're a little bit older from Happy Days, and there's a lot more we're going to try to bring into the conversation, but certainly one of the themes during the 1950s was communism, and I love the way you put it, because you said that back then, because that was sort of the common enemy, you had, and I love your turn of phrase here, if I can remember it right, Adlai Stevenson and Billy Graham were both batters in the same lineup. It is hard to imagine today that a religious leader, Jim Dobson, Tony Perkins, whatever, would be, quote, in the same lineup as, I don't know, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. So it obviously was a very different time than the one we find ourselves in today.
Yeah, and in a way, two things brought Americans together then. The main one was World War II, and the common cause there in the sense that America was in a righteous war, and then immediately afterward,
I guess we lost him, and we'll see if we can get him back. I did not expect that to happen so quickly. So we'll spend some time, if we can get him back, and we'll continue our conversation about that. I think we have him now. Dr. Marsden, we have you back?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Well, somehow we lost something there. Okay.
Okay.
Keep going.
I was saying two things that brought people together in the 50s was, first of all, the common experience in World War II, and everyone supporting that war and being enthusiastic about it. And then secondly, immediately after the Cold War emerges and you have this great menace of the USSR, and that brings a lot of people together, so that even though people are divided between left and right, there's still much more a sense that America has to be strong and be united. So there was a sense of a common cause and the sense of ability to build this consensus culture.
You know, in your prologue, you talk about this national purpose. And if you think about it, the baby boom generation grew up in that time. Baby boom generation goes from 1946 to 1964, 76 million born during those periods of time. Now it's 78 million because of immigration. But this was the generation for whom the war was fought. There was a sense of unity. There was a sense of identity. You had a former General Dwight Eisenhower who serves for 8 years. There is, of course, you have some other things. We'll talk about McCarthyism and some of the rest, but there was a sense of purpose. It also was an expanding economy. So in some respects, people looking back at the 1950s can see them as sort of the halcyon years in which everything was good in America. Your book also, of course, points out that there were a lot of undercurrents that surfaced in the 1960s, didn't they?
Yeah, and in the 1950s, people are already worrying that though there was this great material progress, that it was too superficial, and that Americans were becoming materialistic and losing a sense of higher ideals, and they were being absorbed into the mass culture of TV, that everyone's watching the same TV shows, and the tendency was to go to the lowest common denominator. And so there was a lot of worry during that time about where is America headed. And so even though there is on one side optimism, there's also a good bit of anxiety about the state of the culture and where American ideals are going to come from. Can we just take our ideals for granted? How do we cultivate them and keep them going?
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to focus on one of your chapters there about the mass media and national character. Again, for some of our younger listeners, they can never imagine a time in which we didn't have television, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have a lot of other things, but this was something that was breaking on the scene in the 1950s and changed a great deal. I think certainly Richard Nixon understood the importance of television after the fact with the presidential debates, but also you've talked about this idea of a unified mass culture for the first time, and the questions that were surfacing there which now today maybe a lot of people take for granted. So it's just one of many very important chapters in this book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. Wanted to talk about it because many of the seeds of ideas and movements and very important cultural events can be found in the 1950s, and some played out in the 1960s, and many are playing out today, and we talk about them here on the program. This is a book published by Basic Books, and it is a book written by Dr. George Marsden. We have information about him, information about the book, and also a brief book review that appeared in Wall Street Journal about it, all on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
What are the consequences of marijuana legalization? Some states are legalizing marijuana while others are decriminalizing it. Are there social and medical costs that many legislators are not considering? Kevin Sabat takes on these 7 myths about marijuana in his book, Reefer Sanity. He has served under Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama at the White House Office of National Drug Policy. It was on my program to give a counter-argument to those who are convinced that legalizing marijuana is good public policy. The first myth in his book addresses the commonly held idea that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive. His book has pages of studies demonstrating the health risk, and while it is true that marijuana is not as addictive as tobacco or heroin, there is a noticeable addiction rate. Another myth is that smoked or eaten marijuana is medicine. Some proponents of marijuana legalization have admitted the use of medical marijuana was used as a first step in the process of legalization. He also reminds us that people don't have to smoke opium to derive the medical benefits of morphine. He also takes on some of the public policy issues associated with marijuana legalization. Some argue that too many people are behind bars simply for smoking marijuana. Others argue that the legality of alcohol and tobacco strengthen the case for legal marijuana. He shows in his book that both of these arguments are myths. He also deals with some of the economic arguments for legalizing marijuana. Proponents argue that it will solve the government's budgetary problems. Others point to the supposed success of legalization in European countries. He also shows that these are myths. Finally, he deals with the slogan that the war on drugs and drug treatment is a failure. Many argue that prevention, intervention, and treatment are doomed to fail, but he disagrees and provides evidence to the contrary. Before state legislatures move ahead to legalize marijuana, they should read his book. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. George Marsden with us today as we talk about his book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And I wanted to focus, Dr. Marsden, for just a few minutes on the mass media. Again, for so many young people listening to this program, even middle-aged people, they've always taken for granted that there was television. Yet during the 1950s, as it began to be more prevalent in more and more homes, there were people decrying that it was a vast wasteland, people wondering whether or not some of the ideals of culture were going to be degraded. And it's important to recognize that we, again, take for granted all these forms of mass media. But even though we had radio before, television was sort of a new invention, and it really raised a great deal of anxiety about what America was going to be in the latter part of the 20th century, didn't it?
Right. In 1950, most people did not have TVs. By I think 1953, 54, the great majority of people had TVs. So there's a sudden revolution in that, and TV was unlike radio in that there was less local programming. At that time, there were only 3 major networks, and they tended to be very much alike, so that during any given week there would probably be 15 Western TV shows.
Yeah, you have a list of those there. I'd forgotten about some of those. It was just a long, long list, and I thought you grew up during that time, and you forget how many there really were.
Exactly, and so there was just this worry about, are we really dumbing down the culture to to get as many people to watch TV as possible? The more shallow it is, the more people you can get in there, and that became a great concern. And also, it was very connected with a huge concern of the era was about conformity. Mm-hmm. And many of the writers of the era are worrying about conformity. I know I went to college in the 1950s, and we read The Catcher in the Rye, and nonconformity was the watchword, that you had to be yourself and take a distinct stand, and that was partly in reaction to this worry about, well, what's mass media doing to people? Are we just in a cookie-cutter society? Everyone's moving to the suburbs and has the same kind of family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the message that was being sent out to people was, be yourself. Now, exactly what that amounted to was a bit vague, but it was a message that, for one thing, as far as religious communities was concerned, sent a message to people to say you shouldn't be conforming to whatever it was you were brought up with. You should be yourself and think for yourself and be independent. And there's enough truth in that it is convincing to a lot of people, but it also tended to undermine traditions and undermine religious traditions, and undermine religious communities. I think particularly maybe Catholic communities, which had been so solid and strong up to that time.
You take 76 million baby boomers born in the 1950s and 60s, and then especially the leading-edge baby boomers going through teenage years, teenage rebellion, and then you tell them that you need to not conform and you need to throw off traditions. It's not surprising we had the 1960s that we had. But while we're in the 1950s and television, one more second, I thought we might also talk about a scandal that happened, and you're a little bit older, so you probably remember it better than I do, but I've read about it, obviously. I think some have always heard the person saying, this is the $64,000 question. Well, there was actually a quiz show called that, and it was a big scandal when it was found that Charles Van Doren, probably the most popular and most respected of the contestants, was actually receiving the answers prior to the broadcast. Now, today, Dr. Marsden, if a scandal like that broke out, Wheel of Fortune or whatever it might be, it would be a scandal for a while. But this became a national scandal, which I think illustrates how profound the influence of television was at the time and how it really sort of rocked to the core people's trust and belief in television, did it not?
Yes, there was even a congressional investigation of that incident and of the TV quiz shows in general. Someone said, later wrote, that it was the only thing that exceeded it was the Watergate investigations. and here, basically what was going on was they were feeding some of the answers to these very smart people who were on these TV shows in order to improve the ratings of the shows and make it more dramatic, and that shouldn't have been such a huge surprise to people. But because there was already this anxiety about what's TV doing to our nation, once that scandal broke, you get all sorts of people saying, writing about what's happening to our nation. Are we losing our morals? And there are symposiums talking about the moral fiber of the nation. So it became symbolic of something much larger. You'd think maybe people would just say, "Well, that's show business, and that's what you might expect." But it was very deeply embedded in the image of the national character. What goes on our major TV networks.
Fascinating. Let me move on to one of the other chapters, Freedom in a Lonely Crowd. And, of course, you're pulling that from a very famous book, The Lonely Crowd, but we could use others, The Death of the Salesman, Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. There were a lot of books and other articles that were surfacing, questioning the emptiness of this materialistic world that was unfolding, and really even in some cases questioning whether or not business, living in the suburbs, pursuing the American dream was really going to fulfill the deepest needs that an individual might have.
Exactly, yes. And in a way, you mentioned Mad Men a little earlier.
Oh, sure.
And in a way that depicts some of that, of the mood of the emptiness of the man in the gray flannel suit and the lack of morals in that people were worried about. So that was a large anxiety too, most of which was related to anxieties about mass culture and also about commercial culture. That Vance Packer wrote a book called the
Hidden Persuaders,
Hidden Persuaders, and
right.
that talked about how advertising is manipulating people, and there's even subliminal advertising, and that became a great sensation. People worried about how are we being manipulated, and are we moving toward a brave new world? So there was very interesting. I mean, it's to me, it's just fascinating to read these cultural critiques because these things are new, and people are thinking about them more than now. And now, as you said, we tend to take them for granted, and this is just part of the world we all grow up in. But the things have changed so much as far as the media were concerned, and the expansion of the suburbs and mass prosperity and the like, that there's more consciousness of this is new, this has really important cultural implications.
You know, one of the most popular analysis came actually, and was the start of the modern feminist movement, came from Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique. Now, it didn't come out till the 1960s, early 1960s, but already that was sort of developing during the 1940s and 50s. I graduated from Smith College in 42, working in a number of different ways with McCall's magazine, but that is in large part credited as being the seminal work that led to the modern feminist movement. And it came out again of that sense of emptiness, in this case the emptiness of being a homemaker, the emptiness of living in the suburb, the emptiness of pursuing just a materialistic lifestyle, right?
Yes, exactly. It's all part of that same conversation about what they called mass man, and she's actually still using man in that general sense to include both men and women, but it's are women being put into this cookie cutter suburban mold, and that they're losing their individuality, and what do they need to do to develop individual personality. So it's all part of that same call for people to go out and be yourself. So, I mean, you can see how that discussion of the 50s leads to people taking those issues to the streets in the 1960s, and then all of a sudden, things are beginning to blow apart.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about a few other issues. We've already sort of surfaced a few of those, feminism, for example, and the civil rights movement. What about that? That was very significant. But most importantly, we live in a world where there are just incredible culture wars, and at the end of the book, certainly Dr. Marsden gives some suggestions about what can happen in terms of an inclusive pluralism. I think some of us around the table may agree with that, but the people that disagree with Christianity may not. But we'll continue that conversation, and along the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, you are free to do so. 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Dr. Marsden right after these important messages.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, the 1950s and the Crisis of Liberal Belief. Dr. George Marsden with us. And Dr. Marsden, I thought we might, for just a few minutes, talk about the civil rights movement. Obviously, a lot more of that unfolded in the 1960s. But again, as I've said already, a lot of this goes back to the 1950s. We just had the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision mandating school integration. A few years later, President Eisenhower felt forced to use federal troops to enforce integration in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this was a good example of the broader theme you have, that there were in America insiders and outsiders. Let's talk about the civil rights movement first, those who were completely excluded because of segregation. Then we'll go back into Protestant, Catholic, and some of those issues. But this was a very important time in the civil rights movement, at least the embryonic part of the civil rights movement that unfolded in more significant ways over the next decade or so with the Civil Rights Act and a variety of other actions that came through Kennedy and Johnson. True?
Yes. And it's certainly one of the great accomplishments of the era. If you go back to the 1930s and you realize the way African Americans were routinely treated and excluded from just about everything, from sports and most entertainment, and from clubs and businesses and lots of jobs and so forth. This was something that needed to be addressed, and particularly after fighting a war against, that was in part based against the Nazi racism and the like. Americans had to look at their own situation, and gradually that unfolded, not with lots of controversy, but it was something that needed to be addressed.
Where was the church in all of this, or even Christian organizations? I mean, I guess I can point to a Carl Henry editorial in Christianity Today, maybe, and a few other things, but it doesn't seem to me that the churches that we would call evangelical today, or back then maybe would be called fundamentalist today, were actually speaking to this issue at all. Or am I wrong?
They were not speaking to it very much. That's correct. That the mainline Protestant churches, the more liberal Protestant churches, had taken up the cause, and maybe partly for that reason, the fundamentalist and conservative churches were resisting and basically saying, well, integration is a good thing in principle, but let's go slowly, and so they tended to resist most of the things that were going on. There are a few counterexamples. Billy Graham integrated his crusades and the like, but he didn't really push for the civil rights movement very aggressively at all, and that was generally true of evangelicals, that they were cautious on that issue.
You know, one of the things that runs through this chapter, and actually really through the book, is this idea of a higher moral law, of a natural law. Certainly, Martin Luther King Jr. appeals to that in his letter from the Birmingham jail, and certainly there were attempts to say there were wrongs, and I'm now looking even broader than the issue of race, but those kind of cultural critiques that we now at least expect to hear occasionally from churches and Christian organizations were ones that appeared occasionally, and it's sad that there weren't more of those, because that might have changed the whole direction of the 1950s.
Yes, it certainly is, and it's, of course, it's easy to criticize looking back into another era, but it is an example where the evangelical churches tended to they were cautious, I think, largely because the constituency, their success depends on appealing to their constituency, and they're reflecting a conservatism within the population, and so churches were afraid to get too far out in front on the civil rights movement because then they might alienate some of their people. And so it's a real dilemma when you have very democratically organized churches to really take a leadership stand on a controversial social issue of that sort. So they tended pretty much to hold back.
Well, we're talking about that. Let's, if we can, get into this issue of the twilight of the American Enlightenment. One of the people you mentioned is Walter Lippmann, and he was called, or at least even some of his friends referred to him as the child of the Enlightenment. Explain, if you might, for just a minute for our listeners, what that meant, because it seems to me that this is where the 1950s collapsed, the 1960 radicals picked up, and some of those individuals influenced by the 1960s are serving in power today.
Well, that's sort of the center point of the book, is that in the 1950s, the mainstream cultural leaders, the people who called themselves liberals, and in that time liberal didn't have, it wasn't as nearly as controversial a term as it's become today. People were affirming that there should be progressive civil rights and other kinds of political movements. But, as Walter Lippmann pointed out, what was the basis for the moral beliefs that they were asserting? What's the basis for saying that people should be treated equally? And Lippmann said, we need to go back to what the American founders had, which is a belief in natural law. And he got shouted down by many of the other more progressive leaders who said, we can't do that. That's natural law. That's a Catholic kind of thing, and we have to let our laws evolve, and our moral ideals are evolving. That we understand them in terms of a kind of social evolution, and we are trusting that the best ideals will emerge, but we can't go back to natural law. Well, the irony of that is that a few years later, Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail is appealing precisely to natural law to say this is the thing that we need to appeal to, that there is built into the scheme of things some sort of law in which we can recognize that certain kinds of inequalities are not right, that this is not something we simply invented, but it's something God has built into the moral fabric of reality, and we need to recognize that. So that's an irony, because so many of the progressive leaders of the time were dismissing natural law in other circumstances, but when, of course, Martin Luther King says it, then they admired him and were willing to
sort of allowed it as an exception. Yeah, it's sort of the one exception, and everything else went the other way. Once we don't have natural law, then we can legalize abortion, we can redefine marriage, we can engage in promiscuous sex, we can all sorts of things that unfolded in the 60s all the way to the 21st century came because the argument was natural law is not the basis, but instead an evolving social conscience and conviction is what actually becomes the basis of our society, and we're, in a sense, reaping the fruits of that today, aren't we not?
Exactly. That we're now in a situation where we don't have any real point of reference, that there's no agreed upon moral standard that we can reach. And that's why I call the book The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment ideals were that, and these are the ideals of the American founders, that there is a rational basis for self-evident principles that everyone can be brought to agree with. And in the 50s, people are still trying to hold on to that, but they've gotten rid of what the founders believed in some kind of natural law basis for the morals of society. By the 50s, that natural law idea has eroded, and pretty soon we get to the 60s, and everything's up for grabs, and right becomes pretty much what any community says is right.
Take a break and continue our conversation of the Twilight of the American Enlightenment right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes with Dr. George Marsden as we talk about his book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And in your last chapter, Dr. Marsden, you talk about an inclusive pluralism, and I guess the way to maybe introduce that is to talk about Abraham Kuyper. I mentioned him just the other day when I was talking about here you have an individual who was a great thinker, theologian, pastor, but also prime minister. Really hard to imagine something like that happening today, but nevertheless, an individual that served as a member of parliament, served as the prime minister in the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. But the principle we might want to talk about for just a minute, because we do live in a pluralistic society, and yet it seems to me as Christians, we want an open dialogue and an opportunity to communicate our views, but we also have to be tolerant in the biblical sense of that word, to other views as well. How would you describe that?
Exactly. That's the gist of my argument. I talk about working for a more inclusive pluralism, and one of the things that's happened since the 1970s has been that more and more groups are recognized as having distinct points of view. And one of the things that Christians need to do is to get a better hearing to say Christians have their points of view. There are actually varieties of Christian points of view, but that people who start their thinking with the premise that God has created everything that there is are going to think about everything else somewhat differently, that everything they think about they see in relation to God, so that they see other people as creatures of God and ought to be loved by God, or as C.S. Lewis says, you see these creatures that are destined for an unimaginable eternity. Well, that is a different perception that's at the basis of the way we see things, and so should get recognition that, well, if you have religious beliefs, it's legitimate to have a whole range of things that are distinctive kinds of views, and they should be respected just as other sorts of views are respected. But at the same time, even though we're starting with a different point of view based on God and God's revelation, nonetheless, everybody lives in God's creation. So it does make sense to talk about common elements that we have, or common moral beliefs that we have. And even though other people might not be willing to recognize that there's a natural law, they might recognize that there are moral principles that are built into the scheme of things, that there's a sense of right and wrong that each person has. So there's also there's a common ground. There's a basis for seeing Christians look at things differently from other people, and there's also a basis for cooperation. So what we need to do is to find some way to be trying to build a society in which there is mutual respect for difference. And I think rather than getting into situations where we get standoffs and culture wars, there needs to be a sense of how do we treat others the way we would like to be treated in society. And that's obviously a idealistic sort of view, but it seems to be the kind of principles that Abraham Kuyper is pointing toward. That he was a theological thinker who's saying everything in society should be related to the way we think about God, but we need to recognize also that people are different, and not everybody believes in God, and that people who don't believe in God have their rights, and they need to be respected, but by the same token, people who do believe in God have rights, and they need to be equally respected.
You know, I guess the crunch comes when you talk about how to articulate your beliefs, because you point out that Abraham Kuyper believed that all people share a common experience because they're part of the creation. And so there should be some areas of common grace. And so what I have argued is that in a pluralistic society like we are in today, you really sort of have to argue to your biblical conclusions rather than argue from your biblical presuppositions. There was a time not so long ago that you could say, well, the Bible says da-da-da-da-da, and that would be enough. Now you have to say, well, there is very good evidence in science and history and sociology and whatever to show that the biblical view is good and is a worthwhile public policy. But the problem is, as you also point out in the book, we live in a world today where a lot of people just simply say that no, there is no truth. Truth is a human construction, this postmodernism. And if, as a matter of fact, because of that, if anybody asserts that their view is right, not only for them but for others, they're labeled as intolerant. So sometimes the biggest difficulty in having an inclusive pluralism isn't necessarily coming from people with religious convictions. It's coming from kind of narrow-minded secular people that don't appreciate the fact that we believe that some views are transcendent and apply to all people at all times.
Yeah, and the irony is that you get secular naturalist people who say everything is relative, but on the other hand, they're very dogmatic about certain moral beliefs that they have. So I think you can emphasize both things. You can emphasize both that because we are religious and are dependent on God's revelation, we're going to see things differently, and we're not going to convince people to think the way we do on that basis, but we can get a hearing to recognize that that's a legitimate difference. That there's a lot of talk in the modern culture about recognizing difference and accepting people that are different. So religious difference is one of the differences that ought to be accepted and respected and not be seen as something that's simply backward-looking and against all modern progress, but it's one of the legitimate modern points of view. Just if ethnicity or race or being a man or a woman or whatever is a legitimate point of view, certainly religious viewpoints are equally legitimate. So there should be more recognition that those differences are one of the things that ought to be honored in the mix. And that's in order to do that, you have to be respectful of people who differ from us, but it's a kind of mutuality that we want to cultivate, and that's something where you do appeal to common grace. That there is a sense that there should be a sense of justice about trying to treat everyone as equitably as possible. There's going to be, there's going to be things that there are conflicts about, but nonetheless, that looking for mutual understanding ought to be the fundamental principle that you're working for.
Well, again, some of the insights that you can find in the book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. It is published by Basic Books. We have information about it on our website and also a book review that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Dr. George Marsden, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
We will say goodbye and encourage you to go to our website today. We've got a couple of things that you might want to see. The first one that we talked about in the first hour, Should Christians Embrace Darwinism? Second hour, of course, the book review of The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. Some great resources that are available on our website, pointofview.net. Don't forget that there is a way in which, if you'd like to listen to either the broadcast, especially that first one there on a very important issue of origins, click on that podcast and you can listen to it again, maybe send it off to someone else, and maybe even watch the video that Stephen Meyer talked about. All of that can be found at our website, pointofview.net. As we say goodbye, let me also encourage you, as you're clicking on some of the buttons on our webpage, click on the one that says Donate. We are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring these programs to you, and if you can help us out, we would appreciate that as well. Andrew and Gerald, as well as Catherine, thank you for your help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just